spending, business investment, and employment rates to government programs, tax policies, and interest rates. Understanding inflation is important to the work that many of us are doing. So inflation-related data is one of the few releases that directly applies to the daily cost of living, unlike many other economic indicators. So the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics has various indexes that measure different aspects of inflation, which are the Consumer Price Index, Producer Price Index, and the import and export price indexes. Today, Jeffrey Hill will discuss the various BLS inflation statistics by highlighting aggregate price trends. He will explore a few industries' product areas by reviewing their price trends. And finally, he will discuss some improvements that the BLS is working on. Just a little bit about Jeff Hill. He became the Associate Commissioner for the Office of Price and Living Conditions in 2020. Mr. Hill leads the strategic direction of production, development, and research for 6 divisions focused on prices and spending in the U.S. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics and English literature from Boston University and a master's degree of science in information technology management from Johns Hopkins University. Please note that today's presentation will last about 30 minutes, and at the end there will be a 15-minute Q&A session. So I ask if you could hold all questions to the end, and also enter your questions into the chat feature, which is located to the right of your team's window, and I'll be monitoring the chat. So let's welcome Mr. Jeff Hill.
All right, thank you, Mike. Let me go ahead and see if I can get this PowerPoint going here. Let's see. Okay, can you see that all right?
Yes.
Mike, okay, very good. Well, Mike, I want to thank you and Jeff Gonzalez and Yan Lee for inviting me to come and speak today, and thanks to everyone who is attending. Let's start by talking about the pandemic. The pandemic brought big changes in supply and demand, and you can see just some of the things here that happened. So it's playing a major factor in everything that's going on with price change today, as well as consumer spending, as have the stimulus and recovery funds that were made available to folks to help them make it through the pandemic. So we're going to talk about a lot of this stuff. We're going to talk about consumer spending, which was down 2.7% in 2020 from 2019. So as you know, we have 4 series of price change at BLS. They're listed here for you. Year over year, they have been up dramatically. It's really been a very long time since we have seen price change, this high. We did have a little dip in import prices in August. And other measures like the Consumer Price Index are sort of back to slightly more normal monthly trends. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as we get into this. I'm sure everyone is very familiar with the CPI. I do like to point out always that businesses experience inflation too. So we do measure price change for businesses by tracking both the prices they receive and pay through the Producer Price Index, the Import Price Index, and the Export Price Index. And to varying degrees, businesses either absorb changes in costs or they pass them on to consumers, or both. I never really know exactly how familiar folks are with our data. So let me just show you a little snippet here from a CPI data release. We have what we call the headline statistic, the broadest figure, that's all items. It's part of the data series known as the CPIU because it covers all urban consumers. And then you can see that there's detail below that that covers a wide variety of consumption. You can see the many detailed bakery products. Here's a snippet of the PPI indexes. You can see that the broad pharmaceuticals area is broken down into many more detailed categories. These product areas are complicated, but we really can't understand the aggregate complex economic story without these detailed indexes. And of course, BLS can only publish at such detailed levels when we collect a lot of data to cover, for instance, the many types of pharmaceuticals that companies produce or the types of bakery goods that consumers purchase. And that's why we really appreciate establishments and people who participate in our surveys. We produce more than one CPI. The CPIU is the one that is in the press all the time and gets all the attention. The others, the 5 most prominent others are listed here. I'm going to talk for a minute about the CPIW. That represents inflation experience of wage earners. It's our legacy product. You can see that from the year it was introduced. And it's really important because the Social Security Administration uses it in its calculation of cost of living adjustments for beneficiaries. We'll talk about that just again in a minute. I do like to point out that the chained CPIU is an alternative. It's designed to be a closer approximation to our measurement objective. As in particular, it captures substitutions that consumers make in response to changing prices. We would love to make this our headline product, but it has a major drawback right now. The spending data that we need to calculate it are collected through the Consumer Expenditure Survey, and that unfortunately has quite a lag to it. So we published this index with about a 1-year lag, and we are talking about different things that we can do to try to speed up that process and make this more real time. All right, so on the next slide, I'd like to talk about what difference does a small change make. So as I mentioned earlier, we use the CPIW by law is what is used to calculate cost of living adjustments for Social Security recipients. And the first table here, and this is put together at about this time last year. We're almost ready to do this for 2021. There were 64 million plus beneficiaries. They had an average monthly benefit. And so therefore, out of the Social Security Trust Fund, there was this huge outlay. That is based on the CPIW. If we use the CPIU, the amount that the seniors would have received would have been less. We have another series called the CPI for the elderly, the RCPIE, which actually takes more into account the market basket of goods, sort of more appropriate for retirees. If we had used, if the Social Security Administration had used that figure instead, you can see that there's only a $3 difference in what the average benefit would be for any one person, but it's a huge, huge change in total outlays. So a small change in the CPI makes a big difference. Speaking of which, on the top box here shows you the formula that by law is used for calculating the cost of living adjustments. It's a comparison of the CPIW for July, August, and September of the current year as compared to the previous year. Usually it's the previous year. In some situations, it's the earlier year. And as you can see right now, we have 5 of the 6 numbers that are needed because we just earlier this week published the CPI for August. So this will get a lot of attention next month when the CPI is released, and then it will be clear to everyone what kind of an increase seniors will be getting. Here's an example of recent COLAs. You can see for the most part, they've been pretty moderate. The last, I would say, really big one was in 2008, where it was 5.8%. I don't like to speculate exactly what the new number will be, but I think it is very probable that the new COLA that will start in December of this year for people receiving benefits in January will probably be at that 5.8% or slightly larger. Okay, so this is a chart that I really like. It's something that we kind of tweet out a lot. And yes, BLS tweets, so please follow us on Twitter. And this is just some selected items from the Consumer Price Index, annual changes. And you can see in red all items. And unfortunately, this chart is it's a little twisted here because some of these changes are just so big. Things don't normally quite have these big of changes. So that the one in red you can see is all items. We sort of expect that, since that's the aggregate number, to be on the smaller side. And then you can just see the range of other changes in there. Not surprising that car and truck rental is up so high. Not surprising that motor fuel, used cars and trucks, you've probably heard that in the news. These are areas that are have been experiencing tremendous price change, tremendous price increases. Whereas other things, let's see, we've got some fun ones here: medical equipment and supplies, frankfurters, dishes and flatware, food at employee sites in schools. They're decreasing. Not a surprise about food at employee sites in schools, because so many people are not at their regular employee site. And at schools, we've been getting a lot of good information that many schools are continuing what they often do during summertime, which is provide free meals to students. So we think that is what is accounting for much of what has happened here. For all of our headline indexes, of course, there's a market basket of goods that's associated with them. And I'm not going to go through all the different market baskets, but I just have a couple for you here to see. For the Consumer Price Index, you can see housing, less energy services, accounts for the majority of the market basket. But price change of the broad categories depends on both the magnitude of change and the relative importance of the detailed component categories. So while this is while housing is very important to the CPI, usually there's not a very big change associated in the prices. Whereas at 6%, household energy and motor fuels are not a big part of the market basket, but it's a much more volatile component. So we see that becoming a major force in the index each month. And I point out for PPI, you can see the different categories here, but I would like you to take a look, see if I can put the, oh yeah. Oh, one more try. No, it's not working. I was trying to get my laser pointer on, but the sort of yellowish areas, final demand foods, energy, those areas are goods. And all the rest of that, everything that's sort of bluish, is services. And again, this reflects the fact that the United States economy really is a service-based economy. I think that's interesting to look at. Again, prices during COVID-19, there were sharp drops between March of 2020 and May of 2020, and then large upward price movements that followed. It has been a very challenging time for BLS to produce our price indexes, and if I have time at the end, I'll touch on that briefly, but we have been able to do it. So let's just take a look here at those 4 headline indexes again. There's a general thought that a little bit of inflation is good for the economy, and the Federal Reserve has consistently said that it likes to maintain about a 2% rate on average. And that's sort of what we're seeing here with this chart that runs from December 15 forward. Things are moving, sometimes up, sometimes down, nothing dramatic. Of course, we can see when we get to the pandemic period of early 2020, big drops in the price indexes reflecting price change in the economy, followed by increases. And the key point here is that we really moved beyond recovering prices pre-pandemic. We've really gone past the pre-pandemic timeframe, and price levels are much higher. For instance, but they are kind of now leveling off a little bit. You can see the CPI-U leveling off, even PPI final demand leveling off a bit, and then you can see imported prices dropping actually. So there's a lot of talk about inflation being transitory. This could be a sign that we've kind of reached the max and we're into kind of a new normal and may not be experiencing these big price changes continually each month. We will have to see. Similarly, we have the core price indexes, not as dramatic because the so-called core indexes remove the most volatile components, usually those relating to energy. And so again, we can see those kind of flattening out more recently and even dropping in the case of imports. So energy prices. And I could talk in tremendous detail about why this is happening. Again, I'll just mention that at the beginning of the pandemic, imported oil prices fell sharply, almost 63% in the time frame from January to April. And then, of course, those lower input prices passed through to domestic refined petroleum products. At the same time, there was shutdown and travel restrictions, depressing demand and sending prices even lower. Eventually, around the April timeframe, the countries that form OPEC Plus agreed to initiate production cuts, and prices really started going back up again. And pretty much that has continued. If you remember nothing else from this slide, please remember the deep V that occurs in the February to May-ish timeframe, because that really will impact and be reflected in subsequent slides that I have here. Let's talk a little bit about food. You can see that producer prices went up pretty dramatically around the April-May timeframe, again reflecting the fact that people just were going crazy buying lots of food, and consumer prices went up as well. And since then after that, things kind of flattened out a little bit, but then towards the end of 2020, going up again dramatically. I'm sure you've heard through news reports about supply chain issues, about transportation issues, all of these things likely contributing to this tremendous increase. Lumber is a very interesting story. We've talked about this a lot in the media. Lots of people wanting to work on their homes while they're staying at home and can't do other things. So there's a tremendous demand for lumber. We don't have a lumber index that we publish for the CPI because it's such a small component. But obviously at the commercial level, this is a big deal, and a tremendous amount of lumber, of course, is imported. So at the same time that lumber mills were not fully staffed because they wanted to make sure their employees were protected from COVID, demand was increasing. So of course, prices went way up, and now we see that they are starting to go back down. I always like to talk about a business-to-business sales, a key measure that the Producer Price Index takes a look at. We like to break it into 4 different stages of production. Stage 1 sort of being the most raw materials, and stage 4 being goods and services that are produced and sold for final demand. Again, you can see that same V pattern, and that you can see the fact that prices are still a lot higher than they were pre-pandemic. Okay, I thought it would be good to take a look at some transportation indexes, because the economy really does run on transportation. So we have 2 things here. We have our traditional PPI output index, that's the one in orange, and then we have the input index that demonstrates what input prices, excluding capital investment and labor, what's happening with input prices for these different areas of transportation. And again, you can see that you can see how fast, more recently, the input costs that companies are experiencing are going up, and you can see that in response they are raising prices and they are receiving higher prices as a result. So this one is air transportation. You can see similar things happening with truck transportation, water transportation, and rail transportation. And again, energy is such a key element here. You may have noticed on these slides, I only have the data from up to July of 2021. And the reason for that is that we're just publishing it this afternoon. And so I didn't have time to get the August data into these slides yet. But I did pull rank and got information for this slide. This shows if you looked at the 3-digit NAICS sectors of the economy, and we're looking to see for the last few months, last year actually, were they experiencing more deflation or inflation? You can see that in 2021, the majority of industries were facing inflationary input costs. That's changing just a little bit now in July and August, mainly due to two things. Industries that have lumber as inputs, because those, as we saw, costs are going down, and also petroleum. And I suspect if I had the August data for those transportation charts, we may have seen prices going, we may have seen those indexes trending downward as well due to lower petroleum costs. I would be remiss if I didn't put this slide in here. This is, you can take our data and do all kinds of interesting things with it, but looking at terms of trade between the US and our trading partners, and we have 5 of the major ones here, that's always an interesting thing to do. And we do that by looking at our export price index from a given country divided by the respective import price index. Just kind of measure the relative buying power generated from a country's exports. And both the terms of trade with most countries has risen lately, but except for Canada. And the reason for this is, again, imports from Canada include 2 products where prices have really soared in 2021, petroleum and lumber. And so again, you can see the most recent part where the black line is kind of going back up is probably due to those lumber prices coming down. Let's just switch gears for a minute and talk about consumer spending, because that is a really important part, and we have tremendous data on that. We just published last week the first look at consumer spending for 2020. It's really the most comprehensive look so far at spending during the pandemic. And of course, this is the data that does eventually underlie the consumer price index. All right, so what did this data tell us? In 2020, average annual expenditures for all consumer units were a little over $61,000 a year. That's a 2.7% decrease from 2019. During the same period, the consumer price index was up 1.2%, and average income before taxes increased 1.8%. Average spending on 9 of the 14 major components of household spending decreased from 2019 to 2020. It's a little hard to tell from this chart, like which are the major components and which are some of their subcomponents. And again, we have this more organized just so you can see a little bit about the scale here. But the largest decrease in spending was on apparel and services, which was down almost 24%, followed by personal care products and services, down 18%. There was a 24% increase in spending on reading, which was the largest percentage increase among all the major components. Average spending on food decreased 10.4% from 2019 to 2020. This decrease was driven by food away from home spending, which was down 32.6%, as consumers curtailed visits to restaurants and similar venues during the pandemic. It was offset a little bit by an increase in food at home spending, not surprisingly, up 6.4%. Entertainment spending decreased almost 6% during the period, and that was driven by a 51.7% drop in fees and admissions. Okay. Here we break out major components by composition of the consumer unit. And housing across the board took up a greater share of total expenditures than it did in 2019. It was a 2% increase at the all consumer unit level. That's sort of the latest blue line on the left, a blue bar at the left. Transportation, food, entertainment, apparel, they all gave up some ground to housing in 2020, and even more so for single person households. That is the far right green bar, and single parent, one child, less than 18, which is the next to the green bar, consumer units. Let's see, married couple with children and other married couple consumer units were each allocated the highest shares of all groups to transportation. In contrast, married couple only consumer units allocated the least amount to food and transportation and had the second least to housing. I'm going to turn now just to looking at food. I've already talked a little bit about how food overall went down. It was offset a little bit, food away from home was offset a little bit by food at home. Consumer units with 4 people had the largest increase in food at home expenditures, up almost 15%, while having the smallest decrease in food away from home at almost 24%. Okay. Alcohol. This one really fascinated me. Much like food, alcohol has 2 categories, at home and away from home. And alcoholic beverage expenditures were down 17.4% in 2020, after only a 0.7% decrease in 2019. Again, this is driven by alcohol away from home spending, down 43%, which was offset by an increase at home spending, up 4.5%. I would have thought that would have been a lot higher. I think there's some really interesting things that you can think about in terms of that particular piece of data. Okay, let's talk a little bit about expenditures and income by income quintile. As you might imagine, different income groups experience the pandemic's effect differently. Overall spending increased very slightly in 2 of the 5 quintiles, with the largest increases in the 4th, that was up a little over 1%, followed by the lowest quintile, 0.2%. A 5.5 decrease in overall spending in the highest quintile was the largest decrease. It's very interesting. Among these components of spending, housing and reading increased for all 5 quintiles. Food, alcoholic beverages, apparel and services, transportation, personal care products and services, and education spending decreased across the board. And in terms of income, average annual income before taxes rose 1.8% in 2020, after increasing 5.4% in 2019. And it's worth mentioning that the before tax income does not reflect stimulus payments. All right. I want to touch on poverty for just a minute. The government has an official poverty measure. The Census Bureau puts this out, and the Census Bureau also provides supplemental poverty measures. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we work with the Census Bureau on this, and in particular, we contribute based in large part to consumer expenditure data. We contribute to developing supplemental poverty thresholds. So the official poverty measures and the official threshold really goes back to the 1960s. And clearly, lots has changed since then. And so we have developed these supplemental poverty measures to give folks a different perspective on what's happening, and to account for real changes in the way we live. So if I earned $28,000 a year, under the official poverty measure for 2020, I would be above the poverty threshold. However, when you look at the supplemental poverty measure, and let's say for a moment I am a renter, I would fall below the threshold and would be considered as someone living in poverty. And of course, these thresholds are important, not just for the way the government produces policy, but also for folks qualifying for different federal, state, and local assistance programs. So again, it's just an interesting thing to look at for folks who are interested in this and interested in the many details and complex formulas associated with creating these and calculating these poverty thresholds. This link here will take you to a page where you can find a ton more information about that. I'm going to close in a minute. I just want to tell you that, collecting data for all of our surveys has been a big challenge during the COVID-19 period. We have had to stop in-person data collection. We have really not resumed that at all, with the exception of maybe doing a few drive-bys here or there, but we do not have data collectors going in person to places. We've been collecting a lot of data through other means, mostly online. There are some challenges associated with that. For instance, if I need to price a hammer, because that's in the survey, and I need to find out if the price has changed, we would normally send a data collector into the hardware store to check out the price. So now instead, we're looking at the price of that hammer online. Is it exactly the same price as it would be in the store? Is it even available? Those are things that we would normally take into account that we can't right now by looking online. So we're trying to figure out, how best we make adjustments, if at all, for these kinds of things. There's also some issues with interpreting our data a little bit, and we are studying some things that we may need to do to take into account the COVID-19 period. Seasonal adjustment is definitely one of those things, because to some degree, the pandemic has really disrupted normal seasonal patterns. So we have to think about that. We have to think about maybe what we will do with our weights, since they don't adjust in real time. That's something that we would love to have happen, and that takes us back to that chain CPI that I talked about earlier. But we can't do that right now. So again, we have to see what effects COVID may have on that. And finally, I just want to mention that BLS has videos. We have a number of videos on our different data series. You can get them from going to bls.gov and clicking on publications and then videos. You can get them on by this link or on our YouTube channel. And I think, here is my contact information. You can certainly feel free to send me questions. However, if you have really detailed questions on a particular survey, I really, oh dear. I would ask you to send email to the email addresses here. And I realize that I have to fix the one for the consumer expenditure survey, which I will do, and I think we'll make sure that that is available to you. So with that, I am done, and I can answer questions.
All right, thank you, Jeff. We do have some questions from the beginning. Mark had asked from one of your earlier slides for policymaking when consumers make substitutions to lower price goods, just to make it so those substitutes are reflected in the CPI and a lower COLA. Doesn't this cause a negative feedback loop, hurting the people dependent on the COLAs? He may be misunderstanding this.
Well, yeah, so I'm not quite sure I completely understand the question. And I don't know if I should leave my slides up or try to come back to the video here. Well, I'm back on video. I will just say that, again, that's why we changed the market basket of goods. And we wish we could change it every month. And that's something that we are trying to move towards. But by changing the market basket of goods, that is how we reflect these substitutions. In terms of the COLA, that is what is different between the consumer price index for the CPIU for all urban consumers and the CPIW for wage earners that is used for the Social Security COLA. There are weighting differences to account for what goes into that.
Okay. There's another question from Shirley. Should we be alarmed that spending on education has decreased? What goes into education?
I do not know the exact answer to that question in terms of what goes into that. I believe it is mostly private education for like how would I say this? For primary and secondary schooling, and then for colleges and universities, that would be in there too. But I can't answer that off the top of my head right now. As to whether or not we should be concerned about that, I mean, that's going to be a judgment call that I won't comment on.
Okay. Is there so there's another question from Mark. He's asking if you had covered childcare expenses in your presentation.
Childcare expenses are in the consumer expenditure survey. Yes, they're in there. I don't think that I didn't point out any of those. There would definitely be more information, probably in our data release, or certainly in the detailed data on the website, on the BLS website.
Okay. There another question from Anne Room. She asks, seems counterintuitive that income levels rose the highest in the lowest quintile during the COVID shutdown. Any comments related to that?
I believe that reflects stimulus payments. I believe that reflects the economic impact payments, stimulus and other. Yes.
Okay. There's Mark had asked another question about relating to slide 30. If that slide covered essential workers.
I need to go back and look at slide 30. Sorry. Slide 30, huh? Essential workers. Slide 30 was the one on the thresholds.
Oh, okay.
So I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure which that would be then.
Let's see here. Mark, can you post in the chat if about your essential workers question? So as Mark is doing that, there's another question about the Social Security payments.
Sure.
So Social Security payments are lower than the poverty threshold. if I'm understanding the prior slides together with this one. Another one from Anne.
Maybe if Anne is on the still on the video, we can ask Anne to clarify her question. That might be easier.
Okay, Anne, are you there?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead and ask your question.
I just wanted to clarify my understanding. Is it indeed the fact that the SSI payments, as you showed them in your first couple of slides, come to annual rates that appear to be below those at those poverty thresholds? Am I misunderstanding that?
I think maybe. So what I had showed earlier were the COLA amounts that get applied to however much someone is receiving for Social Security. It would increase by that amount for the COLA.
Okay, thank you. I
Sure.
thought I had seen some slides that showed payments that, were actual payments, like $1,600 a month, $2,500 a month. And
those were averages. Those were averages, yes.
Okay, so those averages, if you annualize them, would be at or less than the poverty levels.
That would be true. Now, you would be hoping, of course, that someone receiving those would be having other income, from other sources.
Yeah, but if they didn't, they don't.
Right.
Which kind of, you'll see I had another question in the chat, so I'll just bring it up now. If that's the case, and there aren't a lot of people who are dependent solely on their Social Security, why would we be looking to change the COLA adjustment indexes, even if it only takes a couple dollars from a month? It's still a hit for those people.
So, and I don't know if you can see my slides.
I can.
We can see this.
Okay, hang on. Let me get back to that one. I think it's right here, right?
Yeah.
Right. So right now, the government by law uses the CPIW, and you can see that the COLA in 2020 was 1.3%. So there's a lot of discussion that what would be better to use would be this RCPIE, one that is geared towards the market basket of goods that apply for seniors. So that would actually be giving them more money.
Okay. That would be, I think that's probably well advised.
But of course, there are going to be other people who say that the CPIW and the CPIU are kind of overstate the true rate of inflation, and that the change CPIU is actually more appropriate. And then, of course, you can see what effect that would have here as well.
Sure.
So,
good points.
It depends on your side of the argument, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was my comment about the chain CPI and the negative feedback loop, is when people substitute lower cost goods, to make it, then the chain CPI would reflect that.
Yes.
Being lower, so they're penalized for, trying to make things work, and the CPI doesn't reflect the same sort of buying power.
There are many different arguments among these indexes. Yes. Yep. And that's probably one reason why this hasn't changed, why the law has not changed, right?
Thank you. That really
Sure.
clarified it, and wonderful presentation. Much appreciated.
Sure. It's a lot, inflation data. There's just so much of it there. You can go really detailed. You can be very aggregate. You can slice and dice information so many different ways. I've talked today sort of at a really aggregate level. We get lots of calls from data users who really need something specific. They need to know what's happening in their industry, or they are setting contracts for prices, whether it's for, plastics or rents right? And so they're really looking for the correct index to use in these contracts to account for price change over time. So it really is such a spectrum of how to use this data.
All right, we do have, there's a few more questions here.
Sure.
There is one from Sonia. She is asking healthcare, regarding to healthcare. Why did healthcare expenditures increase the most for two-person households?
I don't believe I have, let me see if I can find that. I don't believe I have that information at the top of my head here. There we go. Most for, yes. I don't know. I do not know myself. I don't know the answer to that question. I would have to dig deeper into the data to try to understand exactly what's happening there.
Okay. So Sonia, if you could provide your email, we'll try to get in touch with you. There's another question from Eugene. Are we in a inflationary period over all indices? I believe. I guess,
Sure.
are we currently? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna go back up here. And while I'm going back up, I just want to go back, oh, wrong way. I'm gonna go to answer the other question again. You know, at BLS, we report the data. Sometimes we don't actually always capture exactly why things are happening. We try the best we can when we talk to respondents to understand, you know, why prices for a particular good or service are changing. But sometimes we don't always get the information, especially when we go to households and ask them to keep a diary and all the different things they purchase. You know, that's sort of a big ask as it is. And I think if we ask them also to tell us, you know, why a particular cost was changing for them, or why they were spending more on food than alcohol or something, that would probably encourage them not to participate in the survey. So I would say yes. I would say across the board, yes, all of our indices are increasing. We did see this small decrease last month in imported prices. But at these very aggregate levels, yes, prices are continuing to go up. They may not go up as much anymore. We'll have to see. They didn't go up as much in August as they did in July, as they did in June, but price levels are definitely higher than they were pre-pandemic. You know, and when we look at some of our year-over-year numbers, you know, back in April, we were comparing a high number to a very low number because we were sort of in that trough of the V there. You know, we're getting out of that now. So when we're comparing year-over-year numbers, it's really quite an increase.
So there's, okay. Oh, were you done, Jeff, with that question?
Yep, I'm done.
Okay, so there is a question from Sam. They're asking, how often are Unchained Indexes weights updated? Has it been the same since 1921?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I'm not sure I can answer if it's been the same since 1921, but it really depends on the survey. So, for instance, the CPI weights are updated, I think it's every year with a 2-year lag. The import and export weights are updated about that same amount. Producer price index weights, unfortunately, are updated once every 5 years. So with quite a lag. And again, that is because of the source weighting data. And you know, that is what makes it so difficult to create chained indexes. And we could get our consumer expenditure data collected and processed faster, then we would be able to produce that chained CPIU a lot faster.
Okay, great. So there was another question. What is the response rate for these days for the consumer expenditures for the consumer expenditure survey?
I do not know that answer off the top of my head. I'm sorry. I could guess at it, but I would, wouldn't be accurate, so I won't. I assume it's been pretty good. One of the things that we did during the pandemic, because we could not send out data collectors to place diaries with folks, we did a lot of phone calling, talking with folks, and then we put an online diary where they could enter information. This is something that we have been planning to do for a while. We were in the process of building an online diary. With the pandemic, we had to just put it out there. It wasn't really complete. It wasn't everything that we wanted, but we had to put it out there. Folks used it. We learned a lot from it. And we will be officially, putting it as a main way of collecting data next year.
Okay, great. We do have a question from Mitchell. He's asking, how can I politely negotiate a higher salary as a new graduate?
So there's another part of the Bureau that looks at compensation, our Office of Compensation and Working Conditions. And I would have to refer you to their data. You could look at the National Compensation Survey. Also, we've just published new information on job and what jobs are kind of up and coming and where are the real opportunities. So if you go to the BLS website, you will find that information.
Great, thank you, Jeff. So there is a person. Sorry, I'm mispronouncing the name, but the question is, when do you think price indexes will go back to pre-pandemic levels?
That's a fascinating question. I am not going to forecast. One thing that at the Bureau that we don't do is forecast. I will say that I think the other thing to consider is, will they go back to pre-pandemic levels, or will we just have prices at this new high level overall? We're definitely seeing it with lumber, right? I showed the one, let's see if I can get back to that. We showed the lumber, right? Lumber prices are going back. Okay, so that's fine. Lumber, not the largest part of the economy, as I've mentioned earlier. So, what happens with overall prices? I don't know. We'll have to see.
Okay. Do you think, Shirley's asking, do you think more virtual dependent data collection approach is here to stay?
Yes.
Okay. All right, let me see here. Just scanning the chat for questions. I do see a post from Anne. She's mentioning Social Security Administration estimates that 46 million Americans receiving Social Security retirement benefits, 21% married couples, 45% singles rely on Social Security for 90% of their income. And I think we tend to lose sight of the impoverished elderly in the rest of the country because DC area. Okay. All right, I think I see all the questions here. There's a question from, where can we find the information on what jobs are up and coming that the speaker mentioned? Oh, that'd be the employment projections.
Employment projections, yes. Yes.
There's a presentation today on that. So if Sonia, if you can go to the BLS website and look at employment projections and look at their most recent published data, you should find the information that you're asking for there. And I think here, what about housing prices? Did you see the price index for housing? I think you must have missed that. I guess what has been the trend for housing prices, Jeff?
Okay, so this gets to be a little complicated. So how the purchase of homes is not included in the consumer price index because there is a, yeah, thanks Jeff for the occupational outlook handbook, yes. Because there is a investment component to purchasing a home. So the consumer price index, shelter index, includes rental housing and something we call owner-occupied housing. So it's a little complicated. So we have sort of like the market basket for what an owner would have to pay if they rented their home. That is kind of included in the weight, but we don't actually include the purchase price or the mortgage in the consumer price index. Mortgage payments are included in the consumer expenditure survey, but not included in the CPI. You're on mute, Mike.
All right. Thank you so much, Jeff. I think that's all we have. We have a lot of thanks being posted onto the chat. I really appreciate that you're sharing with us your expertise and everything about the different price offices and price data that the BLS produces. And I want to thank everyone here on the call for joining us this afternoon. And I hope you had a great experience. And we do have some questions that I'll contact that person later on. And if you're interested in joining the Washington Statistical Society, please go to Washington Statistical Society website and just click on the join link. So there's two options. There's one for joining as an ASA member, and there's also one that's joining as just a WSS member, Washington Statistical Society member. For professionals, it's $15 for a year, and for students, it's only $3. So if you're curious about it, you can just go there. So thanks again, everyone, for coming this afternoon. Thanks again, Jeff, and have a great day.
Sure. Hey, Mike, can I ask you one question after we stop recording?